Hi everyone, thanks for coming back for part 3. Before I get into what I wanted to explain about Genesis 3:24, I just need to explain what John Kostick was talking about here in this video. And he was explaining how the word light in the Hebrew is the word or, and the word skin in the Hebrew is the word or. They actually sound exactly alike, but they're spelled differently. One is spelled with the aleph, which is the letter A in the Hebrew, which represents the ox, or the bull, which represents God. The ox represents the leader, or the head of the household, and it represents strength, and so it's the letter that represents God. And then the ayin makes the A sound as well, but this is a different letter, and this letter is represented by the I, and it represents knowledge. Okay, so he was explaining this part over here where God made skins for Adam and his wife, for Adam and Eve, to clothe them. And as you can see, it's in verse 21, and it says, "Unto Adam also and to his wife did the Lord God make coats of skins, and clothed them. And the Lord God said, Behold, the man is become as one of us, to know good and evil. And now, lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life, and eat and live forever." And so you see that comes up in verse 22, where it's talking about how the man has become like us, and now he knows good and evil. So I believe this is a representation of the DNA, the way it became once Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And so then it goes on to say, "Therefore the Lord God sent him forth from the garden of Eden to till the ground from whence he was taken. So he drove the man, and he placed at the east of the garden of Eden cherubims and a flaming sword, which turned every way to keep the way of the tree of life." And I'll get back to that verse. But the point that he was making over here in the video is that first Adam and Eve were clothed with light, with this kind of or, and then once they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, they were clothed with the skins. But they're both the word or. Now in this video, Leland Jones was talking about how Jesus is the light, and in fact that's something that they both talked about. John Kostick was also talking about how Jesus is the light. And so Adam and Eve initially would have been clothed with the light of Jesus. And another thing that they both pointed out is how the candle, the flame on a candle, does not cast a shadow. So this would be the kind of light that is so bright that it doesn't cast a shadow. The only way it can cast a shadow is if the light in front of it is even brighter than the light of the flame. But normally it doesn't have a shadow. Okay, so in effect what they did is they traded the light of God for knowledge. And I thought it was interesting, if you go back to Genesis 2:17, this is where God told Adam, he said, "But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die." So this is the beginning of the commandment not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So this would be the beginning of the curse, because they ended up eating from it. And it's interesting that, well, first of all, the number 17 is the number good. And if you go back to Genesis 1, you see that God created the light, and this was on the first day. In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the deep. And I'll get back to this verse, but God said, "Let there be light." So this was right at the very beginning. and God saw the light that it was good. And so the light is synonymous with good, and the number 17 is the number that represents good. However, the number 20, according to this Bible wheel over here, it says that this is spoke 20, which is the resh, and this represents wisdom or knowledge, because it's in Proverbs 9:10, where it says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the holy is understanding. So apparently the letter resh, or the number 20 on the Bible wheel, represents wisdom or knowledge, and that's because the resh means the head, and the head is the seat of the mind. It says over here the key word itself, reshith, is based on the literal meaning of the 20th letter rash, head, thereby signifying the seat of the mind and the center of wisdom in we who bear the image of God. Okay, so the year 2017, based on the numbers, would represent the year of knowledge and good. This word also, or this number also means sacrifice, and it's also represents the number 153, the fish, which represents the church. And it was in Genesis 2:17, which looks like 2017, where God said not to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And then when you go back to Genesis 1, this is when you see that there's a division between the light and the darkness. You see it in verse 4, but then you see it again in verse 7, or 1:7, which looks like 17. It says, and God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. So over here he's dividing the water. And then when you go to verse 14, again, God is dividing the light from the darkness. And then in verse 17 going to 18, because it's just separated by a comma, again there's a division between night and day. It says, and God set them in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. So again, there's a division here that divides the light from the darkness. Another thing that he pointed out that was interesting is that the gematria for the word light is 207. And the gematria for the word skin is 276. And the number 207, if you leave out the 0, looks like the number 27. But the number 276 is a number that I've talked about before. And I've shown this article over here that explains how this number has to do with DNA. And I can put the link in the description box so you can see that again. But this number was coming up in Acts 27 when you put in the Strong's number G777. This is where it comes up. There's only one match for this Strong's number, and it means to fast. It has to do with fasting. And this is where it was talking about the 216 souls that were saved in the ship. And I had explained how I surmised that this had something to do with DNA, because it was talking about cutting the ropes and the cords from the boat, as you can see right here in verse 32. And so this is where the Strong's number comes up, Strong's G777, which means to fast or fasting. Okay, so the number 276 is all about DNA, as it explains in this article, and this was coming up in Acts 27, where the 276 souls were saved. Okay, and the gematria for light is 207, which you can leave out the 0 in Jewish gematria, so I'll make the number 27 as in Acts 27, and then 276 is a number having to do with DNA, and it's the number of the souls that were saved on the ship once the cords were cut. And then he goes on to explain how the difference between the two is 69, and the 9 represents the coiled snake, but the 60 represents support, which is what the priest did when he would hold down the sacrifice. Okay, so the point that I wanted to make, and this is the point that both John Costick and Leland Jones made, is that God is light, or Jesus is light, as it says in 1 John 1:5. It says, "This is the message we have heard from him and announced to you, that God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all." Okay, so now I want to get to what I noticed about Genesis 3:24, and this is what's really fascinating to me, because first of all, I was fascinated by the fact that this word way looks like the number 777. And of course, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And it's interesting that this comes up in John 14:6, which looks like the number 46 over here. But the number 14 also, I believe, represents the 144,000. Because it was in Revelation 14 where it talks about the 144,000. But over here in Acts 24, you not only have the number 14, but you also have the number 24, which is a multiple of 12, and that's what 144 is. It's a multiple of 12 as well. And over here it says, "But this I confess unto thee, that after the way which they call heresy, so worship I the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets." Okay, so Jesus is the way, and Jesus is the light. Okay, so now I'm going to get to what I discovered about Genesis 3:24. And so first I'm going to show you how this reads in the Greek. And over here it says, well, I'll read it in English first. It says, "So he drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubims and a flaming sword, which turned every way to keep the way of the tree of life." Okay, so over here in the Greek, you have the flaming sword, and then over here you have another word that describes the sword, and I'll show you what this word means in the Greek. Okay, it's this word right here, and it's interesting that it has 11 inflections and 23 occurrences, but it's a word that means while being turned, but I'm going to go ahead and give you the extended definition. Okay, you can see that over here. It means to cause to rotate, to turn upside down. And over here it means to twist or plate, to convert, to twist, or to twist about. Okay, so I always imagine the cherubim holding the sword and brandishing it about to keep them away from the tree of life. And so what I realized is that the sword itself is what's twisted, sort of like this image or this image. And what's being protected is the sword, just as they're showing in this image, as well as the tree of life. It's not the sword that's being brandished about to protect just the tree of life, but the sword and the tree of life are being protected by the cherubim. And if you look at this word in the Hebrew, it's Strong's number 2015. It's the word hafak in the Hebrew, which means to turn, overthrow. Of course, Jesus overturned the tables when he cleansed the temple, but the next Strong's word after 2016 is 2017, which is another form of the same word, and it also means to turn upside down, and it's the one used in Isaiah 29 where it says, "Surely your turning of things upside down shall be esteemed as a potter's clay." Okay, so it's the flaming, twisted sword that's protecting the way to the tree of life, which is Jesus. And so Jesus is the light, and he's the sword that turns everything upside down, and he's the way.